All right, let's continue now with the build-up to that much-anticipated two-day public hearings on South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And we're joined this morning by Paul Holden. He is the Director of Investigations at Shadow World Investigations. He speaks to us from London this morning. Paul, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time. For those people who may be wondering, what exactly is genocide? Are you able to tell us possibly the textbook definition of what genocide means?
Sure. I mean, I think genocide, it needs to be understood that genocide is a legal concept rather than a sort of a social concept. So in the court case that's going to be heard at the ICJ, they're applying a legal test about a legal definition of genocide. And to sort of paraphrase, genocide in this case is defined as an attempt to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic or religious group. And that can involve many different aspects. You know, most people think of genocide purely as sort of in the Rwandan example, or perhaps in the Holocaust, sort of the mass slaughter, an organized slaughter where you have an attempt to literally erase a population by killing them, by terminating them. Genocide is slightly wider than that, because it contemplates things like effectively what's being called ethnic cleansing now, which is to force people out of their homeland, or it is to undermine the ability of a population to survive in their homeland, which is why, just in the piece that you heard before, the statements that are being made around relocation, some people would say, well, that's not genocide, they're not killing people, they're just trying to get them to move, is considered genocide because it's considered an attempt to erase the Palestinian people in whole and part, which involves the removal of them from their Palestinian homeland.
This case is going to be split in two parts, Paul. There is the interim measures aspect of it, and that is what I think South Africa is going to be arguing for in the immediate. Talk to us about what ordinary South Africans should understand about what South Africa is asking for in the immediate.
Sure. I mean, I think this is a bit of a Hail Mary in the sense that it's an attempt to use the power of international law to stop an emerging and urgent tragedy. And effectively, what the South Africans are asking the ICJ to do is to issue an order to stop Israel's conduct in Gaza, which they say amounts to a genocide. And on the basis of the papers, it's hard to see how Israel's going to argue against that. But I think that the complication is that there's many different steps that the ICJ can actually take here. So there's this idea of a provisional measure. They could issue different types of orders to the state of Israel around South Africa's application. So, from South Africa's perspective, the best case scenario would be that the ICJ says there's prima facie evidence at this point that your conduct could be considered genocide. On that basis, you must cease all of your operations in Gaza. But they could suggest a different set of provisional measures, like they could, for example, just say, well, in this instance, we direct your government to stop making genocidal statements. Which would be a sort of a moral victory in the sense that the ICJ would be saying to South Africa, yes, you've made your point about genocidal statements, but it would be a bit of a Pyrrhic victory if they tell the Israeli government to stop making genocidal statements, but Israel continues with its conduct. So we wait to see what sort of provisional measures the ICJ decides to embrace. I think for most people who are watching here and who are so concerned about the level of violence and devastation, that the ICJ does actually order a halt to proceedings altogether.
Yeah. Of course, South Africa wants these interim measures to be put in place immediately so that there is a stop to the constant bombardment of Gaza. And linked to that, Paul Holden, has to do with whether or not whatever interim order comes out of this court, it must be enforceable. So there is now the critical aspect here, which tells us that the International Court of Justice does not necessarily have any enforcement measures, nor if you go to the Security Council. So how in the world will South Africa be able to make sure that if this interim measure that they're asking for, they get it, how is it going to be enforceable on the ground?
And I think that's the million-dollar question, right? And I think that the brutal answer is that it relies on the world and it relies on the great powers of the world, as they like to describe themselves, places like the United States and the United Kingdom, to abide by international law and force their ally in Israel to abide by international law. But there basically is no mechanism at this point to get Israel to abide by international law. I mean, Israel's been in violation of international law since 1967. The UN has repeatedly, ruled that, or at least the ICJ, for example, in 2004 ruled that the apartheid wall that Israel built was in violation of international law, yet it still exists, it's still up. And Israel has a history of just defying international law. So there really is it's not like a court in South Africa where, if there's a judgment that finds you guilty of something, then the police takes you away.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen here. I think what it does do, though, it does a couple of very useful things. One is it settles an argument. It'll be very hard for Israel's allies in the US and the UK, where I have to say popular opinion is very much against government policy. Popular opinion is for a ceasefire. Popular opinion looks in horror at what the governments are doing here. And it'll make it very hard for them to carry on defending Israel if a court of law has decided this is a state committing genocide. It is morally indefensible at that point for the states to carry on doing what they're doing. So there's a hope that the judgment would provide a whole series of additional sort of soft power measures to convince these states to act appropriately. I mean, within the UK, it's quite an interesting thing, because if the ICJ does find that there is a genocide that's ongoing, or at least that there's grounds for provisional measures because the conduct could arise to genocide, it has pretty profound legal implications for the UK, because the Genocide Act says very clearly that you can't be complicit in a genocide, which then puts the UK in a very difficult position of, does it continue sending arms to Israel, for example? Because at that point, activists in the UK could bring court applications saying, well, the UK government, the Prime Minister, is complicit in a genocide. So even though there's no formal mechanism right now that says, it'll go, if a judgment is made, there will be some sort of force or body that goes to Israel and says you must stop this, nothing to force Israel to abide by it. It does have a whole series of knock-on sort of legal and political and diplomatic implications that I think most people are hopeful could push the people who are enabling this genocide, which is Israel's allies in the US and the UK, to rein in their ally.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting if indeed this case does conclude that there does seem to be a genocidal intent on the part of what Israel is doing, because that has divided communities where you are in the United Kingdom. Paul, let's then conclude the conversation on the bigger case here, because remember, we said it is going to be split in two. So there are interim measures that are sought right now, and then the bigger case, of course, of what South Africa is arguing, that Israel has violated the Genocide Convention. Yes, there is this popular opinion that says a killing of 23,000 people so far, that cannot be argued against, that Israel is not involved in a campaign of genocide here. But crucial, Paul, for this to be proven, evidence is going to have to come to the fore. And that is part of what South Africa is worried about, the elimination of evidence. Do we know what Israel has been doing, if indeed it has been doing that, to eliminate evidence or destruction of evidence?
I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, we don't know. I think that's the answer. I mean, and I should point out that one of the provisional measures that the ICJ could implement today, based on these hearings today, is to direct Israel to not destroy evidence, is to direct Israel to preserve evidence. So if they do make that provisional measure and it then emerges that Israel has destroyed evidence, that would in itself be a violation of the Genocide Convention. You know, it's difficult to know at this point whether they are destroying evidence. I think there's a tension which you can sort of see in the conduct of Israel. On the one hand, they're obviously quite concerned about this finding. They're quite concerned about the International Court of Public Opinion. And yet politics in Israel is so febrile and at times so, that there is a very aggressive and vocal right wing in Israel that really is totally unapologetic about its approach to Gaza. We've seen statements by sort of leading figures in the Knesset and in government, arguing for the erasure of Gaza in pretty astonishing language. So I can't see how, from this perspective, I can't see how there would be the ability to destroy that much evidence, certainly sufficiently to destroy South Africa's case. And I think what's key there as well is that this is a very different sort of situation to what it would have been 40 or 50 years ago, where we would have relied on state parties, we would have relied on journalists with sort of clunky cameras to be recording everything. But what we do have because of social media and smartphones is just an absolute huge wealth of on-the-ground, immediate video footage of calamities. I mean, I think that's what's been so interesting about this crisis is the extent to which, there's a famous saying that if people see the horrors of war, people would never go to war again. And I do feel like that's something that's been prevailing here in Gaza, is that if you go on Instagram, you go on Twitter, you see some of the most just horrific, brutal imagery of the absolute immiseration of the Palestinian people, of the beheading of children, children losing their limbs, just really just horrific imagery. And I think that provides a bedrock of evidence that is going to be very hard for Israel to destroy or deny.
Yeah. Paul Holden, thank you very much for your time and indeed analysis here and that crucial point, what you said there at the end. South Africa, part of what they are saying in their papers is that every 10 or should we say 15 minutes, a child is killed in Gaza since the retaliation of Israel against what happened on October the 7th. Thank you very much for the time being. Paul Holden, Director of Investigations at Shalderweld